They said I was too much, that I would ruin the holiday. But when my son uninvited me from the Thanksgiving tradition I started 30 years ago, he made a fatal mistake. You cannot erase the mother who raised you. I walked into that house silently, and before the night ended, their celebration turned into a public execution where I held the gavel and they were the ones on trial. My name is Elaine Marston. At 58 years old, silence was something I had learned to live with, though I never quite made peace with it. After my husband passed and my only son, Jacob, moved out to start his own life, the quiet became a permanent resident in my home. It was a stark contrast to my former life as the head chef at the Starlight Federal Nutrition Bureau, where the clamour of pots and the shouting of orders were the soundtrack of my existence. I was a woman defined by service, by the act of feeding others, and by the warmth of a kitchen that never slept. Thanksgiving was supposed to be the one day the silence broke. It was my holy day. The kitchen counter was dusted with flour, and the air smelled of cinnamon, nutmeg, and roasted pecans. I had spent the entire morning preparing 3 pumpkin pies, just the way Jacob liked them, with the crust flaky and the filling dense and spiced. I hummed an old tune, picturing the look on his face when he took that first bite. For a moment, the house felt full again, populated by ghosts of holidays past and the promise of the evening ahead. Then my phone buzzed against the granite countertop. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and picked it up. A message from Jacob. I smiled instinctively, expecting a request for extra whipped cream or an update on their arrival time. Instead, the words on the screen turned my blood to ice. Mom, look, the house is tight this year. Everyone is really busy. It is probably better if you do not come. Olivia says you are a bit too much. I read it once, then twice. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the counter. Too much. The phrase hung in the air, heavier than the humid heat from the oven. I sank onto a kitchen stool, my breath hitching in my chest. Surely, this was a mistake, a joke. Jacob would never say that. He was my boy, the one who used to cling to my leg while I cooked. But then the image of Olivia Brandt rose in my mind, my daughter-in-law. Olivia was sharp angles and cool tones, a woman of calculated perfection who viewed my hearty stews and loud laughter with thinly veiled disdain. To her, a family dinner was a networking event, a performance to be managed, not a gathering of souls. We had always danced around each other, a friction I tried to smooth over with casseroles and compliments, but she had always looked at me as something messy that needed to be cleaned up. Now, she had finally done it. She had convinced Jacob that his own mother was a liability. A wave of nausea hit me, followed quickly by a surge of hot, blinding grief. I looked at the pies, sitting perfectly on the cooling rack. I had built this family. I had fed them, clothed them, and loved them with a ferocity that perhaps was, indeed, too much for a cold heart to understand. But to be discarded like a burnt crust, to be told I did not belong at the table I had set for 30 years. Why, the question hammered inside my skull. Was my love too heavy? Was my laughter too loud? Or was my very existence simply an inconvenience to the picture-perfect life Olivia was trying to paint? I stood up. The grief began to harden into something else, something cold and solid like steel. I was not going to stay here and weep into a napkin while they carved the turkey. I was not going to let a text message erase my place in this world. I went to the closet and pulled out my heavy trench coat. Outside, the November sky had turned a bruised purple, and rain was beginning to slash against the windows. The wind howled through the eaves, a mournful, angry sound that matched the storm brewing in my gut. I grabbed my keys and the box of pies. I was going to Jacob's house. I would not call. I would not ask for permission. I would simply show up. If I was too much, then they were about to see exactly how much of a mother I could really be. The drive to Jacob's house was a blur of windshield wipers and grey asphalt. By the time I pulled up to the curb, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof of my sedan. The house, the one I had helped them with the down payment, glowed like a lantern in the dark. Golden light spilled from every window, casting long, inviting shadows on the wet lawn. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, staring at the home that was supposed to be my sanctuary too. I stepped out into the storm. The cold water soaked through my trench coat instantly, but I hardly felt it. I felt drawn to the large bay window in the living room, the one with the curtains left wide open to showcase the perfect life inside. I crept across the grass, my boots sinking into the mud, and peered through the glass. My breath caught in my throat. Jacob had lied. The house was not tight. It was bursting with life. I saw cousins I had not seen in months, neighbours I had known for decades, and even Jacob's colleagues. They were all there, holding crystal glasses and laughing. Everyone was invited except for me. Then I saw him. Jacob was sitting at the head of the table, laughing at something his boss was saying. In his hand, he held one of the linen napkins I had spent months embroidering with the family initials. I watched as he gestured with it, and then Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling radiantly as she accepted a compliment from a woman standing nearby. I could read the body language clearly. She was claiming the craftsmanship as her own. The vintage candlesticks I had passed down to Jacob were lighting the room. The silver platter holding the turkey was my mother's. My history was being used as stage props for her performance of the perfect hostess, while the author of that history stood shivering in the mud. I moved closer to the glass, my body trembling. It was not just the cold anymore. It was a rage so pure, it felt like it could burn the house down. A window near the patio was cracked open just an inch to let out the heat of the party, and through it, a snippet of conversation drifted out like poison smoke. "Olivia really is a saint," a woman's voice said, distinct and sharp above the din. "I do not know how she manages with a mother-in-law as difficult and controlling as Elaine. I would have cut her off years ago." The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Difficult. Controlling. The words slammed into me. For years, I had thought our distance was just a personality clash. Now I realized the truth. Olivia had not just been tolerating me. She had been actively rewriting my narrative. She had painted a portrait of a monster to explain why she needed to keep me away. She was the victim, and I was the burden she so graciously endured. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was the spare key Jacob had given me 5 years ago for emergencies. Well, this was an emergency. My family was being stolen in plain sight. I did not go to the front door. I walked around to the back, past the manicured hedges, and slipped the key into the lock of the kitchen entrance. It turned with a silent, satisfying click. I stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit me, smelling of roasted rosemary and expensive perfume. I walked through the mudroom and stood in the archway connecting the kitchen to the living area. I did not say a word. I just stood there, dripping wet, clutching my box of pies like a shield. One by one, The heads turned. The laughter died out like a candle snuffed by a sudden draught. The silence that followed was absolute. It rippled through the room until 50 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. Jacob froze, his face draining of colour, but it was Olivia who moved first. She set her wineglass down on the counter with a sharp clink and walked toward me. Her face was a mask of terrifying composure, but her eyes were hard, glittering flints of anger. "Elaine," she said, her voice smooth and sickly sweet, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We were not expecting you. What a surprise." She smiled. But I saw the predator behind her teeth. She thought she could shame me into leaving. She was wrong. "Oh, Elaine," Olivia said, tilting her head with a pity that felt more like a physical slap than a greeting. "I am so sorry about the misunderstanding. We thought you wanted a quiet night alone. You know how overwhelmed you get by large crowds." Her voice was syrup laced with arsenic. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the wet, shivering woman in the doorway and the pristine hostess in her silk dress. I looked past her to my son. Jacob was studying the oak floorboards as if they contained the secrets of the universe. He could not even look at me. He stood halfway between us, his shoulders hunched, physically trapped in the no man's land between the woman he married and the woman who gave him life. "I do not get overwhelmed, Olivia," I said, my voice steady despite the cold water dripping from the hem of my coat onto their expensive rug. "But I am curious about the text Jacob sent. He said I was too much. I would like to know. Too much in what sense?" The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Olivia laughed, a tinkling, hollow sound that grated against my nerves. "Oh, stop it. You are being dramatic right now. This is exactly what I meant. Let's not make a scene in front of the guests. Elaine, it is unbecoming." "It is a valid question," I persisted, refusing to lower my gaze. A man near the fireplace, holding a tumbler of amber scotch, cleared his throat. It was Brad, one of Jacob's college friends, whom I had fed countless dinners to when they were students. He looked tipsy and confused by the tension. "I mean," Brad slurred slightly. "Liv said you were just, you know, not really cut out for this kind of thing. Too old-fashioned. She said you were a bit too poor to understand the image of the new family dynamic. That you are judgmental and do not know how to behave in polite society." The silence that followed was absolute. "Brad," Jacob hissed, his head snapping up. "What?" Brad shrugged, looking around. "I am just repeating what I was told so we can all move on. She said Elaine is a nice lady, but she drags the social credit down." My heart did not just break. It pulverized. Too poor. I had scraped every penny I earned at the Nutrition Bureau to send Jacob to that private university where he met these people. I had worn the same winter coat for 10 years so he could have new textbooks. I had refinanced my home to help them buy this very house. And this was how my history was retold as a shameful, poverty-stricken anchor dragging them down. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I did not cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, paralyzing frost. I looked at Jacob, waiting for him to defend me, to scream, to tell them that his mother was a queen who built a kingdom out of scraps so he could sit on a throne. "Mom?" Jacob stammered, his face flushing a deep, shameful red. "Olivia she wants everything perfect. You know how you get with your opinions. You are always correcting people. Maybe it is best if you just go home and dry off." He was not protecting me. He was protecting her lie. He was willing to let me be humiliated to keep the peace with her. Olivia crossed her arms, her patience evaporating. The mask slipped, revealing the tyrant beneath. Jacob, control your mother? This is humiliating. Tell her to leave before she ruins the entire evening. I watched the dynamic play out with a sudden, terrifying clarity. It was not a partnership. It was a command structure. Olivia snapped her fingers, and Jacob jumped. She did not just want me gone because I was annoying. She wanted me gone because I was the only tether Jacob had to a reality she could not control. She was isolating him, cutting off his roots so she could be the only voice in his ear. I took a step further into the room, water pooling around my boots. I am not leaving, I said softly. This is my house. Olivia spat, stepping forward. Is it? I asked, as I scanned the room, trying to find a place to set down the pies. My eyes landed on the antique mahogany desk in the corner of the living room. It was Jacob's workspace, usually kept meticulously clean. But tonight, in the middle of a party, it was cluttered with papers. That was a detail that did not fit Olivia's perfectionism. I squinted. The papers were not work documents. They were bank statements. I recognized the blue logo on the top of the stack instantly. It was the credit union where I kept my retirement savings. Next to it was a thick folder with a legal seal and a pen uncapped, as if someone had been working on them right before the doorbell rang. Why were my financial records sitting out on a desk during a Thanksgiving party? Why did they have my file? The sadness in my chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp suspicion. This was not about a dinner. This was not about me being too much. This was something far more sinister. I looked from the papers to Olivia, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. I stepped toward the mahogany desk, ignoring the sudden, sharp intake of breath from Olivia. The room felt small. The air sucked out of it, leaving only the scent of expensive cologne and betrayal. My hand hovered over the messy stack of papers, trembling not from cold, but from a dawning, horrific realization. I picked up the top sheet. It was a quarterly statement from my retirement account, the one I had built slowly, dollar by dollar, over 30 years of standing on concrete floors in a commercial kitchen. The balance was there in black and white, $142,000. It was not a fortune to people like Olivia, but it was my entire life. It was my independence. Beneath it lay a form I had never requested. It was a beneficiary designation form. In the blank space where my son's name had been for a decade, a new name was scrawled in aggressive, looping blue ink, Olivia Brandt. My stomach churned. I looked up, and my eyes caught the gaze of the man who had spoken earlier. Brad. He was swaying slightly, holding his drink, and he leaned toward the woman next to him, whispering loud enough for me to hear. He said that Olivia told them she had finally sorted out the mother-in-law issue. He said she claimed the assets were being moved for safekeeping. Safekeeping. The word tasted like ash. I dug deeper into the pile, no longer caring about manners or privacy. This was a crime scene, and I was the victim. Under the financial forms, I found a piece of heavy, cream-coloured paper. It was a medical certificate. The letterhead belonged to a doctor I had never met. A Dr. Aris Thorne. I scanned the text, and the room began to spin. The document diagnosed me with early-onset cognitive decline and temporary incapacity. It claimed I was a danger to myself. It stated that I required immediate, supervised care. Beside it was a glossy brochure for a facility called Serenity Hills. It was a private nursing home, the kind where families deposited their unwanted elders to be forgotten. The date on the admission application was filled out for next Monday. They were not just stealing my money, they were stealing my freedom. They were going to lock me away. I looked up slowly, the papers crinkling in my fist. My eyes found Jacob. He was not looking at Olivia anymore. He was looking at his shoes, his face pale and sweaty. And then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, shattering my heart more completely than any insult could. Jacob knew. I remembered 2 months ago when he came over for dinner. He had asked for my social security number, claiming he needed it to help me file for a tax rebate. I remembered 3 weeks ago when he asked where I kept the deed to my house, saying he wanted to make sure it was safe from fire. I had given him everything. I had handed him the knife he was now using to carve up my life. This was not a sudden misunderstanding. This was a conspiracy. For months, while I was baking them pies and knitting them scarves, they were building a cage for me. My son, the boy I had nursed through fevers and heartbreaks, had sat at my table, eaten my food, and planned my erasure. The tears that had been threatening to fall moments ago evaporated. Intense heat replaced the cold rain on my skin. The grief of a mother losing her son died in that instant, replaced by the survival instinct of a woman cornered. I smoothed the paper in my hand. I did not scream. I did not collapse. I looked at Olivia, who was now watching me with the terrified eyes of a gambler who realizes the house has just caught her cheating. She expected me to break. She expected the emotional, loud, embarrassing mother she had described to her friends. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I carefully placed the papers back on the desk, exactly as I found them. I was not going to run. I was not going to cry. I was going to burn their little plan to the ground. And I would start by lighting the match right here, in front of everyone they tried to impress. I turned my back on the desk and the damning evidence, leaving them there like a loaded gun on the table. I walked silently into the kitchen. This room used to be my sanctuary. I ran my hand along the granite island, remembering the afternoon I taught Jacob how to emulsify a vinaigrette right here in this spot. He had been 25 years old, eager to impress a date, laughing as he whisked the oil and vinegar. Now, the kitchen was sterile, a showroom for Olivia's vanity, devoid of the warmth that comes from actual cooking. I picked up a tray of hors d'oeuvres and turned to face the crowd that had spilled in from the living room. They were watching me, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the crazy old woman to start screaming. But I did not scream. I became the hostess they did not know they needed. I walked up to a woman I recognized as one of Olivia's tennis partners. "The crab cakes are lovely, aren't they?" I asked, my voice calm and conversational. "Olivia has such expensive taste. It is funny. She told me last week she was worried about the mortgage payments being 3 months behind. But I suppose one must prioritize appearances." The woman choked on her drink. 3 months behind," she whispered, looking toward Olivia. I moved on before she could answer. I stopped next to Jacob's boss, a tall man with silver hair. "It is so nice to meet you. Jacob talks about you often. He admires your work ethic. It reminds him of his father. My husband was a mechanic. You know? He worked 16 hours a day with grease under his fingernails so Jacob could wear suits like that." The boss looked at Jacob, who was shrinking into the corner. I thought Jacob said his father was an architect, the man said, frowning. Oh, did he? I smiled sweetly. Creative license, I suppose. Olivia rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. Elaine, please. You are confusing everyone. Maybe you should sit down. I am not confused, Olivia, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. But these people might be. You told them I was incompetent. You told them I was poor. You told them I was a burden. I am just trying to clarify which version of the truth we are celebrating today. The room was thick with tension. Then, a voice spoke up from the back. It was Marty, one of Jacob's oldest friends from high school. He had been quiet all evening, nursing a beer, clearly uncomfortable with the pretentious atmosphere. She is right, Marty said, stepping forward. He looked at Jacob with disappointment. This is just like when Olivia made you uninvite your own half-brother to the wedding. She told us it was because of capacity issues. But I heard her tell you that the son of your father's ex-wife was too trashy to be seen in the photos. The heir left the room. The son of the ex-husband, my late husband's child from his first marriage, was a good man. A carpenter who had always been kind to Jacob. Olivia had erased him because his hands were rough and his clothes were simple. Olivia's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. The mask was slipping. She looked around for support, but the guests were avoiding her eyes. They were realizing that the woman standing in the wet coat was not the villain of this story. I took a step toward Jacob. Do you remember? Jacob. When you were 10 years old and you broke the neighbor's window playing baseball, you were terrified to tell your father. I held your hand while we walked over there to apologize. I told you that a man is defined by how he owns his mistakes, not by how he hides them. I let the memory hang there, a stark contrast to the web of lies Olivia had spun around him. I am not the one hiding things tonight, Jacob, I added softly. No one said a word. The silence was not awkward anymore. It was heavy with judgment, and all of it was directed at Olivia. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance vanish. In its place was a dawn of realization. She had thought I was just an obstacle to be removed. Now she saw me as I truly was, the one person who knew where all the bodies were buried, and the only one brave enough to dig them up. I smiled at her. A small, cold curve of my lips. I had the room, and she knew it. Jacob grabbed my elbow, his grip desperate, and pulled me away from the prying eyes of the living room into the formal dining room. He pushed the double doors shut, but I noticed the latch did not click. Good. I wanted the world to hear this. He turned to me, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. Mum, you have to listen to me, he pleaded, his voice cracking. It is not what it looks like. It is not what you think. I stood perfectly still, smoothing the wet fabric of my trench coat, maintaining my dignity while he unraveled. It looks like theft. Jacob, I said. It looks like you were planning to declare me incompetent and lock me away so you could access my savings. No, never, he insisted, pacing the small oriental rug like a caged animal. Olivia just said that your retirement fund was sitting there doing nothing. She said she could invest it. She works in finance. Mom. She knows these things. We were going to double it for you. It was supposed to be a surprise. She said if we moved the funds into the family trust, we could avoid taxes. And the medical power of attorney? I asked, my voice low and steady. The nursing home brochure for next Monday. Jacob stopped pacing. He looked like a child caught stealing candy, not a grown man of 35. He could not meet my eyes. She said you were getting older, he whispered. She said we needed to be prepared. She told me that Dr. Thorne said you were showing signs. I signed the papers because I trusted her judgment. She said she just wanted to protect the assets in case you got sick. I did not read the fine print. Mom. I just signed where she told me to sign. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time in years, I did not see malice in his eyes. I saw something far more dangerous. I saw weakness. I saw a man who would rather sign his mother's life away than have a difficult conversation with his wife. He was not the villain. He was the accomplice. And in some ways, that broke my heart more than if he had held the knife himself. Jacob, I said, I forgive you for being foolish. I forgive you for being blind. He let out a breath, a sob rising in his throat, and took a step toward me. Mum, I am so sorry. I did not know it was like this. But I cut him off, my voice hard as granite, stopping him in his tracks. I do not forgive you for watching. You stood there while she erased me. You handed her the eraser because it was easier than fighting for me. Tears spilled over his cheeks. He reached for my hand, but I tucked it into my pocket. I was not there to comfort him. I was there to survive. Suddenly, the doors flew open, slamming against the walls. Olivia marched in, her face a mask of fury. She had abandoned the pretense of the perfect hostess. Her hair was slightly askew, and her eyes were wild. "Get away from him!" she screeched, pointing a manicured finger at me. I knew you would do this. You are twisting everything around. You are manipulating him just like you always do. The guests had gathered near the open doorway behind her, their drinks forgotten. They were witnessing the unraveling of the perfect facade, drawn by the shouting. I looked at Olivia, then at Jacob, who was wiping his eyes and shrinking back from her rage. I turned back to her and smiled, a genuine, calm smile that I knew would drive her over the edge. Manipulation? I asked softly. I think that is your specialty. Olivia, not mine. I am just the mother who brought the pumpkin pie. Olivia snapped. The carefully curated persona of the benevolent, upper-middle-class wife shattered completely. You selfish old hag, she screamed, her voice cracking with venom. It is my money. We deserve it. You are just wasting it in that pathetic apartment while we are trying to build a future. Jacob is mine now, and you are nothing but a leech that needs to be scraped off. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the hallway heard it. She had just admitted it all. She was not investing for me. She was stealing for herself. I looked past her shoulder at the crowd. Their faces were pale with shock. Olivia froze, her chest heaving, realizing too late that she had just screamed her confession to an audience of 50 people. I reached into the deep pocket of my rain-soaked trench coat. My fingers closed around the cold metal of a small flash drive. It was lightweight, but it held the weight of my entire future. I walked past Olivia, who was still trembling with rage, and moved toward the massive flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace. The guests parted like water, their eyes wide with anticipation. I found the USB port on the side of the screen and plugged it in. The smart TV menu flickered to life, bright and jarring in the dim room. I picked up the remote control from the coffee table. You think you can tell your story, Olivia? I said. my voice steady and cutting through the tension. But I prefer the version you tell when you think no one is listening. I selected the first file. It was an audio recording, accompanied by a timestamp from a home security camera, the very system I had paid to have installed for them last Christmas. The date was from 30 days ago. Olivia's voice filled the room, sharp, clear, and dripping with malice. She is just so slow. Jacob, it is painful to watch. She is old news. We need to clear the path. I cannot have her dragging down our portfolio. If we move her assets, she will not even notice until it is too late. She trusts you blindly. It is pathetic. A gasp rippled through the room. Jacob looked up at the screen, his mouth slightly open, but I did not give them time to process it. I clicked the next file. This was a video. It was recorded from a webcam on a laptop sitting on a kitchen counter. Olivia was on the phone, pacing back and forth with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked vibrant and happy, a stark contrast to the cruelty of her words. "Have you seen that dump she lives in?" She laughed into the phone. "It is actually perfect for our plan. We can tell the social worker it is a health hazard, mold, drafts, whatever we need to invent. It is enough to justify the transfer to Serenity Hills. Once she is in the facility, we get power of attorney over the house. We flip it, sell it for cash, and boom, the credit card debt is gone. We just have to warehouse her somewhere cheap." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing against the eardrums. 50 people stood frozen, staring at the woman they had toasted just an hour ago. Olivia's face drained of all colour. She looked like a ghost. She shook her head frantically, backing away from the screen. "That is fake," she stammered, her voice rising in panic. "That is not real. You used AI. You manipulated it. You are trying to frame me." I reached into my coat again and pulled out the original documents I had brought with me, the bank transfer authorization and the medical certificate. I held them up for the room to see. "Is my signature fake too?" "Olivia," I asked. "Because I took these documents to my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, 3 hours before I came here. He has already filed an emergency motion to freeze my accounts and yours. He told me not to come here tonight. He said it was dangerous. But I told him I needed to look you in the eye when the hammer fell." "You set me up!" Olivia shrieked. She lunged toward me, but stopped when she realized no one was moving to hold her back. "This is entrapment. You cannot record me in my own house. This is illegal." A heavy chair scraped against the wooden floor. Sitting in the corner was Frank, a man I had known for 20 years. He was a retired detective, a man who had spent his life putting people like Olivia behind bars. He stood up, his face grim and set like stone. "Actually, Olivia," Frank said, his voice gravelly and authoritative. "New York is a one-party consent state, and considering you are discussing fraud, elder abuse, and grand larceny on those tapes, I would say entrapment is the least of your worries. That is probable cause. That is criminal evidence." The air seemed to leave Olivia's body. She looked at Frank, then at the guests, who were now looking at her with open disgust. She turned to Jacob, but he was staring at the floor, his hands covering his face. "No, no, you do not understand." She began to ramble, her hands clawing at the air. "I did it for us. We needed the money, the club fees, the car payments, the renovation. It cost so much to be us. You cannot do this to me. I am the victim here. She is the monster." She is the one who would not die fast enough. She was not finished. The silence of the room seemed to provoke her, drawing out the venom she had stored for years. She spun around, her eyes wide and unseeing, pointing a shaking finger at her own friends. "Do not look at me like that!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You all think the same things, Sarah. You told me last week that your mother-in-law was a leech who should have stayed in Florida. And you, Mark, you laughed when I said Elaine's cooking tasted like poverty. You are all hypocrites. I was just the one brave enough to do what had to be done." Sarah gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth, stepping back as if Olivia were contagious. Mark looked down, his face burning with shame, but he did not step forward to defend her. Olivia was burning down the entire social circle she had worked so hard to infiltrate, desperate to spread the guilt, to make her sin look like a collective norm. But it was not working. She stood alone in the center of the room, a manic figure in a silk dress, panting as the weight of her exposure crushed her. I stood by the television, the blue light of the screen casting long shadows, watching the woman who had tried to erase me finally erase herself. The legal trap had snapped shut, but the social execution was far more brutal, and she was doing it all on her own. Jacob looked as though he had been struck by lightning. The colour had drained from his face, leaving him a pale, trembling ghost of the man who had opened the door an hour ago. I watched his eyes dart back and forth, replaying every argument, every compromise, and every time Olivia had isolated him from his friends and family. The fog was lifting. He was finally seeing the strings she had attached to his limbs. He was realizing that the woman he slept next to was not his partner, but his puppeteer. Olivia saw the change in his eyes too. Panic surged through her, primal and ugly. She stomped her foot on the hardwood floor, desperate to regain the control she was losing by the second. "If you love me, you will stand by me," she screamed, her voice shredding the last remnants of decorum. "You will kick her out right now. Show them you are a man." Jacob did not step forward. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step backward. He looked at her not with love, and not even with anger. He looked at her with revulsion. It was the way one looks at a stranger found standing in their bedroom in the middle of the night. He looked at her as if she were a monster wearing human skin. "I am seeing a man," Jacob whispered, his voice shaking but audible in the silent room. "But I do not know who you are." I stood in the center of the room, my wet coat heavy on my shoulders, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The fear was gone, the anxiety that I was too loud, too opinionated, or too much was gone. I was exactly enough. I was the truth standing in a room full of lies, the silence stretched out, uncomfortable and thick. Finally, a voice broke it. It was the wife of Jacob's boss, a woman who had been glaring at Olivia since the recording of the phone call ended. "I think you should leave. Olivia," the woman said coldly. "You have done enough damage for one night." Olivia whirled on her, her teeth bared. "Leave, you cannot tell me to leave. This is my house, I decorated it. I chose the paint, I chose the furniture. This is my home." I stepped forward, my boots squelching softly on the rug. "That is not entirely true. Is it?" I asked calmly. Olivia froze. "You chose the paint." "Yes," I continued, keeping my voice level. "And you certainly spent the money. But the deed I remember when we signed the papers, Jacob had bad credit because of his student loans. So I co-signed. But you..." You had that bankruptcy from your first marriage that you tried so hard to hide. Your name is not on the title. Olivia. It never was. Olivia turned to Jacob, her eyes wide with desperation. Tell her she is lying. Tell them this is our house. Jacob looked at his wife. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a profound, crushing sorrow. He shook his head slowly. Mom is right, he said, his voice flat and dead. My name is on the deed. Yours is not. We talked about adding it next year, but we never did. The air went out of Olivia. She looked around the room, searching for an ally, for anyone who would look at her with anything other than contempt. But there was no one. Her friends, her colleagues, the people she had preened for were all looking at her like she was something contagious. She had played a high-stakes game of social climbing, and she had just fallen off the ladder. I looked around the room. No one was looking at me with pity anymore. No one was whispering about the wet woman with the cheap coat. They were looking at me with something that felt strange and new. They were looking at me with respect. The woman who was too much had turned out to be the only thing holding the moral center of the room together. I had walked in as a pariah, but I was standing there as the matriarch. And Olivia knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she had lost everything. The room was quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence that usually follows a violent storm. But I was not finished yet. There was one last tradition to uphold. I walked over to the side table where I had set down the white bakery box when I first arrived. It was damp from the rain, the cardboard slightly warped, but the contents were pristine. I carried it to the center of the dining table, pushing aside the expensive floral centerpiece Olivia had likely spent $500 on. I brought dessert, I announced. My voice was calm, contrasting sharply with the chaos I had just unleashed. Jacob looked at me, confused. Mum, please, we do not need pie right now. Oh, I think you need this one, I replied. I lifted the lid of the box. Inside sat what looked like my signature pumpkin pie, covered in a golden brown crust. I picked up the silver cake server Olivia had been using earlier to serve her store-bought appetizers. The guests gathered around, drawn in by a morbid curiosity. They watched as I pressed the server into the center of the pie, but the metal did not sink into soft custard. It hit something solid with a dull thud. I used the server to peel back the top layer. It was not pastry. It was a sheet of parchment paper, carefully painted and shaped to resemble a crust. And underneath, there was no nutmeg-spiced filling. There was no pumpkin. Resting inside the pie tin, wrapped tightly in wax paper to protect it from the elements, was a thick stack of documents. I reached in and pulled the packet out, placing it on the polished wood of the table with a heavy slap. I unwrapped the wax paper slowly, savoring the moment. It was the master copy of the dossier I had compiled over the last week, the one my lawyer had finalized this afternoon. This, I said, smoothing the cover page, is a formal complaint filed with the district attorney's office regarding elder abuse and attempted fraud, and this, I pointed to the second stack, is a cease and desist order regarding the unauthorized access of my bank accounts. And this last one is a restraining order petition, citing your recorded threats against my safety. Olivia stared at the papers. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish pulled from the water, gasping for air that was no longer there. The color had drained so completely from her face that her heavy makeup stood out like a mask. I looked up at Jacob. He was staring at the papers, reading the legal headers. Then he looked at me. The shame was there, deep and painful. But beneath it was something I had not seen in a long time. It was awe. He looked at me, not as his elderly mother who needed managing, but as a force of nature. He realized in that moment that while he had been cowering in the corner, I had been fighting a war to save him from his own bad decisions. "You prepared all of this?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I protect my family, Jacob," I answered, "even when they do not know they need protecting." A low murmur of approval went through the room. The guests, the people Olivia had tried so hard to impress, were nodding. They were on my side. They saw the strength it took to stand alone against a predator. "This is insanity!" Olivia suddenly shrieked. She lunged toward the table, her manicured claws reaching for the documents. "Give me those, you have no right." She never reached them. Frank, the retired detective, moved faster than a man his age should be able to. He stepped between Olivia and the table, catching her wrist in mid-air. He did not say a word. He just looked at her with eyes that had seen enough criminals to know exactly what he was holding. He dropped her hand with a look of utter disdain. Olivia stumbled back, clutching her wrist. She looked around the room, searching for a friendly face. But there were none. Her court had been dissolved. She was alone. I did not yell. I did not scream. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a register that was terrifyingly calm. "You told Jacob I was too much," I said. "You told him I would ruin this family. You were wrong. You did not remove me from this family, Olivia. But make no mistake, I am removing you." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Olivia looked at Jacob, but he turned his face away. The rejection was absolute. A sound tore from her throat, a mix of a sob and a scream of frustration. She realized she had lost not just the battle, but the entire war. She turned and ran toward the front door, her heels clattering frantically on the floor, fleeing the house she claimed was hers, running into the rain and the dark, leaving us in the light. The front door slammed shut, echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. The sound seemed to sever the last invisible string holding Jacob upright. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where his wife had been, before his knees finally gave way. He did not fall dramatically. He simply sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. He looked like a little boy again, the one who had scraped his knee and needed his mother to tell him the pain would pass. He started sobbing, a deep, guttural sound of release, murmuring apologies over and over. I walked over to him. I did not pull him into a hug to hide him from the world. He needed to feel the weight of this moment. I simply placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. "I do not want you to choose me, Jacob," I told him, my voice soft but firm enough to be heard in the quiet room. "I never did. I just wanted you to choose what is right." He looked up, his face wet with tears and twisted with shame. "I let her do it," he confessed, his voice cracking. "She made everything sound so logical. She told me I was helping the family, and I stopped thinking. I stopped being me. I do not even know who I am anymore without her telling me." It was the truth I had waited years to hear, but I could not fix this for him. "Then you have to find him again," I said. "You broke this. Jacob, you have to fix it. No one can do the heavy lifting for you anymore. Not her. And not me." The room was still quiet. But the tension had shifted. It was not hostile anymore. It was warm with empathy. Sarah, the woman who had recoiled from Olivia earlier, stepped forward tentatively. "Elaine," she said, "the turkey is getting cold, and we would be honored if you stayed. Please." The others nodded, murmuring their agreement. It was not pity. It was genuine respect. I hesitated. My trench coat was still damp, and I was exhausted. But looking at Jacob, broken on the floor, I knew I could not leave him alone in the wreckage. "I will stay," I said. "But Jacob sits next to me, just like he used to." We moved to the table. The atmosphere was subdued but authentic. For the first time in years, Jacob spoke freely. He talked about his father, telling a story about a fishing trip that Olivia had always banned him from retelling because she thought it was boring, blue-collar nonsense. He talked about the smell of my Sunday pot roast and how much he missed the simple comfort of home. I watched the colour return to his cheeks. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes was fading, replaced by a flicker of the sun I remembered. The invisible wall Olivia had built between us was crumbling, brick by brick. Justice, when it came, was swift. The documents I handed over that night were more than enough. The authorities opened an investigation into Olivia for fraud and elder abuse within 48 hours. She tried to fight it, tried to spin her web of lies, but the recordings were damning. She had dug her own grave with her own words. It has been 1 year since that night. Jacob is seeing a therapist now, learning how to untangle his self-worth from the approval of others. It is a long road, but he is walking it on his own 2 feet. As for me, I realized something profound that night. I was never too much. I was simply too strong for a weak person to handle. I was too sharp for a liar to deceive. And I was too loving to let my family be destroyed without a fight. That Thanksgiving was not just about a turkey or a pie. It was the day I took back my voice. It was the day I reminded the world, and myself, that a mother's love is a force of nature, and you should never, ever bet against it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I read as many as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help us share these stories with even more people.